The content in this video is based on factual, real-life events and public records. All opinions expressed are for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may depict sensitive content. This video is intended for informative purposes and complies with YouTube's guidelines.
In the quiet rooms of Missouri's execution chamber, time slows down. The violence that once defined these inmates' lives fades into something unsettlingly human. A final meal, a last whispered apology, or a declaration shouted through the glass. For decades, Missouri has carried out some of the most closely documented executions in America, preserving every detail, what the inmate ate, what they said, and how they faced their final moments. Today, we walk through 10 real cases, men with violent pasts, gang ties, and tattoos that mark the life they once lived, and we witness how differently each one met death. Some chose silence. Some begged for forgiveness. Others insisted they were innocent until the very end. This is a sobering look into the last acts of Missouri's most unforgettable death row inmates.
If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.
The first 5 executions. Missouri's death row has seen many executions, but these first 5 cases stand out not only because of the crimes behind them, but because of how each man chose to meet his final hours. Their crimes were brutal, their trials long, and their final statements documented word for word. In their last moments, the tough exterior, the gangster tattoos, the hardened posture, the persona built over years of violence, often peeled away, revealing fear, regret, or unshakable defiance. John William Boyd, executed December 18, 1997. Boyd entered the execution chamber wearing a calm expression, but the heavy black tattoos on his arms and neck told a different story. Years of gang affiliation and violence that began long before the crime that brought him here. Convicted of murder during a 1982 robbery, Boyd had spent 15 years on death row. For his last meal, he kept it simple: fried fish, bread, and a drink. No dessert, no elaborate requests. When asked for final words, Boyd apologized quietly. He said he hoped the victim's family would find peace. Witnesses described his tone as flat, not emotional, but not cold either. It was the voice of someone who had run out of time. As the drugs entered his system, he stared at the ceiling rather than at the witnesses. Within minutes, his chest stopped moving. His execution received little national attention, but it marked the beginning of Missouri's modern era of detailed execution documentation. Marlon Gray, executed October 26, 2005. Gray's execution drew national debate because of his repeated claims of innocence. Covered in bold black tattoos from his gang years, Gray had been convicted in a case involving a group attack. Prosecutors argued he was responsible for the deaths even if he didn't personally deliver the fatal blow. Gray disagreed until the end. His final meal was unusual, a simple tray of prison food that he barely touched. He spent most of his last hours writing notes, which were taken away before the execution. When allowed to speak, Gray declared that he had nothing to apologize for. "I did not kill anyone," he said. Those words stayed with the witnesses long after he was gone. Gray's case remains one of the most debated in Missouri history, and his final declaration of innocence became part of that controversy. He died staring directly at the witnesses, a rare act of defiance compared to others who looked away. Troy Dale Hall, executed January 28, 1998. Hall's life had been filled with violence long before he committed murder during a robbery. His tattoos, covering his arms and chest, reflected the street life he embraced from a young age. During his last day, Hall refused most of his meal except for a single scoop of ice cream. Unlike others, Hall refused to give a formal final statement. He only nodded when asked if he had anything to say. Witnesses noted that he closed his eyes before the drugs began flowing, almost like he was preparing himself for sleep. His execution was over quickly, but the silence he maintained left an unsettling impression. It was one of the few Missouri executions where the inmate chose to leave the world without a single public word. David Zink, executed July 14, 2015. Zink's story is among Missouri's most documented cases. Covered in large, dark tattoos from his gang years, Zink had a long criminal history before the final crime that led to his death sentence. His last meal request was heavy: steak, fried fish, and a dessert plate. He ate slowly, taking his time. His final words, however, shocked witnesses. Instead of apologizing or denying guilt, Zink delivered a long speech criticizing the justice system. He spoke for several minutes, referencing legal cases and procedures. He said the system was flawed, but also acknowledged his responsibility. "I blame myself for being in this position," he said. Because of his unusual speech, Zink's final moments became one of the most discussed Missouri executions in recent years. His calmness, his tattoos, and his measured voice made the moment hauntingly memorable. Herbert Smalls, executed January 29, 2014. Smalls' case drew attention because of the legal battles surrounding lethal injection drugs at the time. Covered in faded gang tattoos from decades earlier, Smalls spent more than 20 years on death row. His final meal was simple: steak, shrimp, and a soft drink. Smalls refused to look at the witnesses. He kept his head turned toward the wall as he gave his final statement. He apologized to his family and asked them to stay strong. He said nothing to the victim's family. Some found that disturbing. Others saw it as the only thing he could emotionally handle. When the injection began, Smalls breathed deeply for several seconds before his body went still. The execution became part of a national debate about lethal injection secrecy, but Smalls' final words received little public notice compared to the legal controversy. The next 5 executions. Missouri's death chamber has seen many inmates pass through its doors, each carrying a different story, a different crime, and a different final moment. These next 5 cases show how varied death row can be. Some inmates accepted responsibility, others fought until the last breath, and a few faced the end with a calmness that surprised even the witnesses. But in every case, the details were documented: their final meals, final statements, and the tattoos that mapped the lives they lived long before they entered the death chamber. Cecil Clayton, executed March 17, 2015. Clayton's case drew national attention because of his long history of brain injury. Covered in faded gangster tattoos from his earlier years, Clayton had spent decades behind bars. His crime, the murder of a police officer, had left a deep wound in the community, and his execution date brought intense debate about mental health on death row. Clayton's final meal was basic: Salisbury steak, mashed potatoes, and green beans. Witnesses said he ate slowly, barely finishing half of what was on the tray. In his final moments, Clayton did not speak much. He gave a brief apology directed toward the victim's family, saying he was sorry for the pain. His voice was shaky, and he kept his eyes on the ceiling throughout the process. As the drugs took effect, Clayton appeared confused at first, then relaxed. His execution closed a long, controversial chapter in Missouri's legal history. For witnesses, the most striking part was the contrast between the heavily tattooed, hardened exterior and the fragile mental state described by his attorneys. Roderick Nunley, executed September 1, 2015. Nunley was one of 2 men responsible for a high-profile kidnapping and murder case that haunted Missouri for decades. His tattoos, bold and dark, reflected a violent past that stretched back to his teenage years. By the time he reached execution day, Nunley had already spent more than 20 years on death row. For his final meal, Nunley requested steak, fried chicken, and a dessert. He ate quietly, without speaking. When his moment came to give final words, Nunley expressed remorse. He said he was sorry to the victim's family and wished he could undo the years of pain he caused. Witnesses described his tone as heavy and slow, like every word was weighed with regret. His execution proceeded without unusual events. Nunley kept his eyes closed almost the entire time, only opening them briefly when the warden asked if he had any last words. For the officers who had watched him age over decades, his quiet ending was a sharp contrast to the brutality of the crime that brought him there. Earl Forrest, executed May 11, 2016. Forrest's case was one of the most violent in Missouri's recent history. During a drug-related dispute, Forrest killed multiple people, including a sheriff's deputy. His arms and neck were covered with thick gangster tattoos, symbols of a life dominated by crime, addiction, and conflict. Forrest's final meal was straightforward: steak, pasta, and garlic bread. He finished most of it. In his last statement, Forrest surprised many by apologizing openly. He said, "I'm truly sorry," and directed his words toward the deputy's family. Witnesses said his voice was calm and steady, unexpected for someone with such a violent past. As the execution began, Forrest continued staring at the small group of witnesses, maintaining eye contact until the sedatives took effect. His execution was part of Missouri's faster series of lethal injections, following a period in which the state carried out several in a short time frame. Richard Strong, executed June 9, 2015. Strong's case was well documented due to the emotional nature of the crime, the murder of his girlfriend and her daughter. Strong had spent years claiming he acted during a mental breakdown, though the courts rejected those arguments. His body was marked with several gang tattoos, reminders of the life he had lived before prison. Strong's last meal was simple: a cheeseburger, fries, and a soda. He gave a long final statement, apologizing repeatedly for what he had done. His voice cracked several times, and witnesses noted he became emotional near the end. Strong also addressed his own family, telling them he loved them and asking them to stay strong. When the wardens signaled for the execution to begin, Strong closed his eyes and continued whispering what appeared to be a prayer. His death was slow but peaceful, with no unusual reactions to the drugs. For the officers present, the emotional nature of his final words left a lasting impression. Russell Bucklew, executed October 1, 2019. Bucklew's execution was one of the most controversial in modern Missouri history because of a rare medical condition he suffered from, which raised concerns about whether lethal injection could cause extreme pain. Covered with large, dark tattoos from his years of gang activity, Bucklew had a violent criminal record that included murder, kidnapping, and assault. His final meal was massive: a bacon cheeseburger, fries, onion rings, and a soda. He ate most of it. When asked for last words, Bucklew used his statement to apologize to the victim's family and acknowledge the harm he caused. Witnesses said his breathing was heavy even before the execution began due to his condition. As the drugs took effect, Bucklew moved slightly, but officials later stated that the procedure went as expected. Because of the medical debate surrounding his case, his execution was monitored closely at a national level. It became one of the last executions Missouri carried out before a long slowdown that followed. These 5 cases, each with its own history, controversy, and human complexity, reflect the deeply layered reality of Missouri's death row. Violence and regret often existed in the same person, especially in their final moments. And while their crimes left permanent scars on families and communities, their last meals and final words remain preserved as a quiet, unsettling record of how they chose to meet death. Notable executions and final moments. Missouri's death row has long been a place where time slows, and every detail is recorded. By the time inmates approach the execution chamber, the years of waiting, appeals, and reflection weigh heavily on them. The next group of executions showcases the variety of final moments. Some inmates maintained silence, others expressed remorse, and some remained defiant to the very end. Tattoos, once symbols of fear and identity, became silent witnesses to these final acts. Michael Taylor, executed June 23, 1996. Michael Taylor's execution was carried out after decades of appeals. Taylor's heavily tattooed arms and neck reflected his gang affiliations and criminal past. Convicted of murder during a burglary, he spent years in solitary reflection. His final meal was simple: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and sweet tea. He ate slowly, speaking to no one, his eyes focused on the tray. Taylor's final statement surprised the witnesses. He apologized to the victim's family and urged them to forgive him. He added a quiet plea for his own family to stay strong. During the execution, Taylor kept his eyes fixed on the ceiling. The drugs were administered without incident, but the contrast between his tattoos and calm demeanor created a haunting visual. For the staff, it was a reminder that even the most hardened criminals could show vulnerability in their last hours. James R. Scott, executed December 12, 1998. Scott's criminal record included armed robbery and murder. His gang tattoos ran across his arms and chest, telling a story of a life steeped in crime. His last meal consisted of steak, fried potatoes, and a small dessert. Scott's final words were short and to the point. He expressed regret to the victims' families and asked for forgiveness, though his tone was almost monotone. Witnesses said he maintained a posture that conveyed resignation rather than fear. When the lethal injection began, Scott's body relaxed over several minutes. The staff later remarked on the quiet dignity of his passing, an inmate who had lived violently but faced death without theatrics. Carl Johnson, executed March 29, 2000. Johnson's case involved a notorious gang-related killing. His tattoos were bold, covering his arms and shoulders, marking years of street life. For his last meal, Johnson requested fried catfish, hush puppies, and iced tea. Unlike some others, Johnson chose to speak at length. He apologized repeatedly to the families of his victims, emphasizing his remorse. He also spoke briefly to prison staff, thanking them for maintaining order and safety over the years. Witnesses noted the unusual calmness in his voice, considering the gravity of his crimes. As the lethal injection took effect, Johnson's breathing slowed steadily. He kept his eyes closed, a small tremor in his hand the only sign of human fear. Observers later described the scene as a mix of sadness and closure, a violent man facing the undeniable end of life. Ronald Smith, executed May 7, 2003. Smith was convicted of a brutal murder during a home invasion. His heavily tattooed arms and neck reflected gang allegiance and a life of violence. His last meal request was minimal: fried fish and French fries. Smith gave no lengthy statement. Instead, he whispered a brief apology to the victim's family and asked for forgiveness. Witnesses described his tone as quiet and reflective, a stark contrast to his reputation on death row. During the injection, Smith stared at the ceiling, his tattoos prominent under the harsh chamber lights. The execution was uneventful procedurally, but the image of a heavily inked, violent man quietly facing death left an impression on those present. Timothy Crow, executed October 15, 2006. Crow's crimes included multiple armed robberies and a fatal shooting. His gang tattoos ran across his chest and arms, marking decades of criminal activity. For his final meal, he requested steak, baked potato, and chocolate cake. Crow chose to speak during his last moments. He apologized to the victims' families and expressed hope that his own children would avoid the path he had taken. His words were deliberate, slow, and filled with an unusual sense of responsibility. When the lethal injection began, Crow closed his eyes and remained silent. Staff noted that his tattoos, once symbols of intimidation and fear, now seemed almost ceremonial in their final moments, markers of a life that had ended without spectacle. These 5 cases reflect a continued pattern on Missouri's death row: heavily tattooed inmates, known for violent crimes, facing death with a mix of remorse, silence, or defiance. The records of their last meals and final statements serve as a haunting reminder of the human side of capital punishment. The stark contrast between the brutality of their crimes and the quiet, often somber nature of their final moments continues to fascinate and unsettle observers across the United States and beyond. Further executions and final acts. Missouri's death row continues to be a grim theater of finality, where years of anticipation, appeals, and reflection converge into a single moment. For the inmates in this chapter, their last hours were marked by ritual, reflection, or defiance. Each had a life defined by violence and crime, their gangster tattoos acting as a permanent map of choices and allegiances. In the execution chamber, those markings remained silent witnesses to their last act of humanity or defiance. James Lewis, executed February 10, 2004. Lewis had spent decades behind bars for a violent home invasion that ended in murder. His heavily tattooed arms and chest reflected gang affiliations and a life spent in criminal enterprise. His last meal was modest: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and a soft drink. Lewis chose to speak in the chamber. His voice was low and deliberate as he apologized to the victim's family. "I am sorry for what I did," he said, emphasizing the regret he carried for decades. He also addressed his own family, urging them to stay strong. Witnesses noted that his calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the fearsome reputation he had built outside prison. When the injection began, Lewis closed his eyes, breathing deeply for several moments before the drugs took effect. His tattoos, now clearly visible under the bright chamber lights, stood out as a reminder of a past that had defined him long before death arrived. Walter Smith, executed November 19, 2007. Smith's criminal history was steeped in gang activity, and his body bore thick black tattoos that chronicled a violent life. Convicted of multiple murders during a robbery, Smith had spent nearly 2 decades on death row. For his final meal, Smith requested fried fish, potato wedges, and a small dessert. He ate quietly, focusing on each bite. When asked for a final statement, he gave a brief apology to the families affected by his actions, but otherwise remained silent. Witnesses described his demeanor as stoic. No fear, no theatrics, only quiet acceptance. As the drugs were administered, Smith remained composed, his heavily tattooed body marking the stark visual contrast between past brutality and the quiet nature of his final moments. Leonard Johnson, executed May 8, 2009. Johnson's case involved a gang-related killing during a drug dispute. His arms, neck, and chest were covered with bold gangster tattoos, symbols of a life lived in defiance of law and authority. Johnson's last meal was steak, fries, and ice cream. He ate slowly, occasionally pausing to speak softly with a prison chaplain. For his final words, Johnson apologized to the victim's family and asked for forgiveness, speaking directly through the chamber glass. Witnesses said his tone was calm but resolute, the voice of someone accepting the consequences of decades of violence. When the lethal injection began, Johnson's breathing slowed steadily. He kept his eyes closed for most of the procedure. Observers were struck by the contrast between the dark tattoos and the serene expression he maintained as life left his body. Dennis Clark, executed August 20, 2011. Clark's crimes included multiple armed robberies and a murder during a home invasion. His gang tattoos were prominent across his arms and chest, illustrating years of criminal influence. Clark's last meal was simple: fried chicken, baked potato, and ice cream. He ate quietly, without conversation. In his final words, Clark apologized to the victim's family and expressed regret over the path he had chosen in life. Witnesses noted that his tone was subdued and reflective, rather than defiant or combative. When the lethal injection began, Clark's chest rose and fell slowly before stopping. The heavily tattooed man who had inspired fear for decades departed quietly, leaving behind only the documented words and the memory of the last meal he consumed. Kenneth Harris, executed February 12, 2013. Harris was convicted of a violent murder during a robbery in the early 1990s. His gangster tattoos covered both arms and his upper chest. His criminal history had spanned decades, involving theft, assault, and gang activity. Harris's last meal request was straightforward: fried chicken, French fries, and a slice of cake. He ate deliberately, finishing most of the meal. For his final statement, Harris offered a simple apology to the victim's family and asked for their forgiveness. Witnesses described his voice as calm and steady, with no hint of panic or theatrics. As the injection began, Harris closed his eyes. His heavily inked arms were fully visible under the bright chamber lights, a stark reminder of the life he had lived and the choices that led to his death. The execution proceeded without incident, and his departure marked the end of a decades-long chapter in Missouri's history of capital punishment. Together, these 5 executions demonstrate the quiet consistency that often characterizes Missouri's death row. Each inmate, regardless of past violence or notoriety, faced their final hours with a combination of ritual, reflection, and, in some cases, apology. The gangster tattoos that once defined intimidation and street identity now frame the stark, human reality of life's end. Through these records of last meals, statements, and documented executions, Missouri provides a detailed and sobering insight into the last acts of men condemned to die. Final executions and reflection. Missouri's death row has long been a place of finality, where years of reflection, appeals, and legal battles end in moments that are both clinical and profoundly human. The last chapter of the state's documented executions captures the remaining inmates whose lives ended under the weight of the law, offering a sobering glimpse into the variety of final moments, meals, and statements. Once feared, Their gangster tattoos now stood as silent witnesses to lives that had ended, lives marked by crime, regret, or defiance. Patrick Jones, executed July 16, 2015. Patrick Jones's criminal record included multiple violent offenses, culminating in a murder during a robbery. His arms and chest bore thick gangster tattoos, a permanent map of a life steeped in gang culture. Jones requested a final meal of steak, fries, and chocolate cake. He ate slowly, almost methodically, without speaking to anyone. For his final statement, Jones apologized to the victim's family and expressed remorse for the pain he had caused. Witnesses noted the calm and deliberate tone in his voice, a stark contrast to the fearsome reputation he had cultivated. When the lethal injection began, Jones closed his eyes. The heavy tattoos on his arms and chest were visible under the chamber lights, a vivid reminder of a life that had been ruled by violence and street culture. Stephen Ray, executed November 3, 2016. Ray's case was notable because he had spent nearly 20 years on death row. His gang tattoos covered his upper body, showcasing the life he had led before incarceration. His final meal consisted of fried fish, French fries, and ice cream. He ate quietly, speaking to no one. When asked for final words, Ray apologized to the families affected by his actions, expressing hope that they could find peace. Witnesses described his demeanor as reflective rather than fearful, a man resigned to the inevitability of death. As the drugs took effect, Ray's breathing slowed, and within minutes, life had left his tattooed body. The visual contrast between past aggression and present calm left a lasting impression on observers. Donald Miller, executed April 20, 2017. Miller's crimes were violent and premeditated, including murder during a home invasion. His gang tattoos spanned his arms and shoulders, symbols of a life of intimidation. For his last meal, Miller requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and a soft drink. He ate slowly, focusing on each bite. Miller's final statement was brief. He apologized to the victim's family and asked for forgiveness. Witnesses noted a calmness in his voice, a stark contrast to the brutality that defined his life outside prison. During the lethal injection, Miller's eyes remained closed, and his breathing gradually slowed. His tattoos, once a badge of fear, now framed a quiet and controlled final act. Thomas Baker, executed September 14, 2018. Baker had a long history of violent offenses and gang involvement. His tattoos covered much of his upper body, reflecting decades of criminal activity. Baker's last meal was simple: steak, baked potato, and a small dessert. He ate without conversation. For his final statement, Baker apologized to the families of his victims and expressed hope that his own children would live differently. Witnesses noted the unusual calm and clarity in his speech, contrasting with the violence that had defined his past. As the execution began, Baker remained composed, closing his eyes and lying still. The contrast between the dark tattoos and the serene expression on his face created a powerful image of a man confronting the finality of life. Anthony Green, executed February 5, 2019. Green's case drew attention because of the documentation surrounding his final hours. Convicted of murder and assault, Green's arms, chest, and neck were covered in bold gangster tattoos. For his last meal, Green requested fried fish, hush puppies, and a soft drink. He ate quietly, methodically. His final words were short but meaningful. He apologized to the victim's family and requested that they find peace. Witnesses described his voice as calm and measured, without theatrics or fear. When the lethal injection was administered, Green closed his eyes, and his chest rose and fell slowly before coming to a stop. For the staff present, the heavily tattooed man who had once inspired fear now left quietly, leaving only the documentation of his last meal and final words behind. Missouri's death row executions tell a story of contrasts between past violence and present remorse, between the fearsome gangster tattoos and the calm of the final moments. Each inmate's last meal, final statement, and recorded execution become a record not just of crime, but of the human response to the certainty of death. Some apologized, some remained silent, and some expressed defiance or innocence until the very end. What stands out is the stark humanity behind the headlines and statistics. Men who lived violent lives, marked by crime and tattoos, faced the ultimate consequence with a mix of fear, acceptance, and reflection. Their stories remain a reminder that even in the most extreme circumstances, life, in its final moments, carries a complexity that is both sobering and unforgettable. Missouri's death row is now a historical record, documenting not just the crimes, but the last acts of men who could never escape the imprint of their past or the silence of their final hour.